300 ancient Qurans. Now, as well as Ian McEwan, I should also, of course, mention Salman Rushdie. Now, Salman Rushdie is in many respects one of the first British victims of Islamism, and as a result, he speaks again with remarkable clarity about it. Writing Mirabile Dictu in The Guardian, he was allowed to say, "These Islamists, we must get used to this word Islamists, meaning those who are engaged upon political projects, and learn to distinguish it from the more general and politically neutral Muslim. The Muslim Brotherhood, the blood-soaked combatants in Algeria, the Shia revolutionaries of Iran and the Taliban, poverty is their great helper, and the fruit of their efforts is paranoia. This paranoid Islam, which blames outsiders, infidels, for all the ills of Muslim societies, and whose proposed remedy is the closing of those societies to the rival project of modernity, is presently the fastest growing version of Islam in the world." And he went on to outline his opposition to Islamism and what required to be done. Now, there's one other novelist that I wanted to mention as well, who I can bracket with McEwan and Rushdie, not just because he's a novelist who's every bit as good, but because he's a novelist who's, if anything, even more direct. And that's Martin Amis. Some of you may have seen an interview that Martin Amis gave to The Independent last week, when various of its readers emailed questions into him. One of those questions was, "What is the most depressing thing about Britain you have observed since your return? And the best?" And he said, "The most depressing thing was the sight of middle-class white demonstrators last August waddling around under placards saying, 'We are all Hezbollah now.' Well, make the most of being Hezbollah while you can. As its leader Hassan Nasrallah famously advised the West, 'We don't want anything from you. We just want to eliminate you.' Similarly, when I went on Question Time the other week, a woman in the audience, her voice quivering with self-righteousness, presented the following argument. Since it was America that supported Osama bin Laden when he was fighting the Russians, the US armed forces, in response to September the 11th, quotes, 'should be dropping bombs on themselves,' end quotes. And then the audience applauded. It is quite an achievement. People of liberal sympathies, stupefied by relativism, have become the apologists for a creedal wave that is racist, misogynist, homophobic, imperialist, and genocidal. To put it another way, they are up the arse of those that want them dead." Now, that's one good reason why Martin Amis is a novelist, and I am a politician, because he can say things like that. But the reason for mentioning all these three is because they, to my mind, represent a reaction from within the left, which has been inspired and provoked by what the left has been saying and doing in the last 5 years. And I think it's important that we don't underestimate the bravery that's required by people whose friendships, whose literary connections, whose jobs, indeed whose future reviews depend on keeping faith with that broader left-wing view of the world. And it is striking the way in which, and I'm no literary expert, the way in which, since Martin Amis started making these arguments, his novels have been reviewed in an altogether chillier way. And since Ian McEwan started making these arguments, that the New York Review of Books turns its cultural guns on someone whom beforehand they lauded to the sky. Now, one of the reasons, I think, why these writers are reacting in the way that they have is because they're aware of that broader and more dangerous trend within the left that I've tried to discuss in Celsius 7.7. In the past, it was the case that the radical left used to project their fantasies of revolution onto the proletariat. The proletariat had an unfortunate habit of rejecting those fantasies and going off and buying council houses and holidaying in Marbella, voting for Margaret Thatcher instead. And as a result of the collapse of those fantasies, people on the radical left found new icons onto which they could project their fantasies of revolt against the bourgeois order. And they started out by romanticizing rebels in the Third World Liberation Movement, hence Che Guevara on 1,000 T-shirts and bedroom walls. And sometimes, again I have to be fair, that projection of ardor onto Third World revolutionary struggles wasn't entirely wrong. I think that if it weren't for the energy and the idealism of, for example, the anti-apartheid movement in the 1980s, then South Africa would not have enjoyed the transition to multi-party democracy that it has at the moment. But one of the problems that the left fails to acknowledge generally, for all these individuals whom I've cited are sufficiently clear-sighted to see, is that that romanticization of third world liberation movements has morphed into something altogether darker. The belief that my enemy's enemy is automatically my friend. And so therefore anyone who stands in opposition to American power, to globalization, to the West and to the bourgeois order is automatically to be supported or idealized. And that's why we had individuals marching under the banner, "We are all Hezbollah now." Because amongst fashionable intellectuals, the idealization of liberation movements had moved into the idealization of terror. It's a phenomenon which I've called in the past the Prada-Meinhof tendency. The way in which NW3 can make common cause with the hardest figures in southern Lebanon or in southern Basra. And against that tendency, what I believe we can see in the works of all the authors I've cited is a moral revulsion at the way in which individuals have completely lost their bearings because they've been so blinded by hate. But there's more to it than that as well. These individuals also see in Islamism not just a threat abroad, they also see it as an ideological force that menaces free expression in the West. One of the striking things about Salman Rushdie is that he was brave enough, along with a variety of other intellectuals, to put his name to a letter which appeared in a French newspaper last year, specifically citing Islamism as a new totalitarianism, and pointing out in the aftermath of the Danish cartoons controversy the way in which Islamist thought and Islamist activity was attempting to close down and to freeze out free expression in the West. And I think one of the striking things more broadly is that within, certainly, the creative world, there's a new sense that Islamism isn't simply the expression of the rage of the dispossessed in one part of the third world. It's a potent attempt to close down free expression in the West as well. And in that respect, that clarity of foresight reflects an understanding, a deep understanding, of the ideological wellsprings of Islamism. The thinkers behind Islamism, people like Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood's chief ideologist, Syed Qutb, or their brother ideologue, Maududi, the founder of Jamaat-e-Islami in South Asia, all of them were quite explicit about their opposition to Western values of free expression, democratization, a secular space, women's rights. And one can see that in those states which have actually followed an Islamist path, like Iran, all those manifestations of repression taking place. And one of the things which I think has encouraged the growth of anti-Islamist intelligentsia here in the UK has been the bravery of figures in the United States on the liberal left in pointing out both the intellectual roots of Islamism and also the consequences of turning a blind eye to it. And in that respect, I would particularly cite the work of Paul Berman, the author of Terror and Liberalism and Power and the Idealists. Those two brief works, I think, are some of the most illuminating works that have been written about the contemporary dangers that we face. And it's intriguing that Paul Berman's name should have been prayed in aid by what I think is one of the most exciting developments in British political life in the last 18 months. So exciting that you won't have read about it in any of the mainstream newspapers, except in a brief passing reference. And that's the launch of something called the Euston Manifesto. The Euston Manifesto was a declaration by a variety of individuals on the left, politicians, journalists, intellectuals, and academics, that they were disgusted with those on the left who were making excuses for totalitarianism, for clerical fascism, and for Islamist parties and Islamist organizations that were attempting to close down free expression. And what was really interesting about the Euston Manifesto is that it reflected the sense of dispossession amongst many on the left, that their voices weren't being heard in the mainstream media or the mainstream conversations. What's really striking about it is that the person who was behind it in the first case here, Norman Garrett,